So this is actually a really, really fun model to paint. I don't think I've actually attempted this kind of a style before. It's not quite an heavy metal style where I've highlighted every single edge and I've taken care to paint every detail. Especially when it comes to army painting, I want to be quick about it, and I always think, okay, well, I'm painting for a tabletop, so 3 to 4 feet, good rule of thumb. Strong highlights on the front, good contrast. Not too much worry about the details spent in the back. And especially when it comes to armies, one of the things I'm almost always adamantly against is edge highlighting um, without purpose. So my Caradron are a very good example of this, where the only thing I highlight are top edges and battle damage. Similar with my Necrons, right? I don't highlight everything underneath. There's a lot of stuff in the back that I don't edge highlight. And the goal is, because I'm painting for the tabletop, I'm looking to get these armies done and playable in a reasonable amount of time. I'm avoiding edge highlighting, which does take quite a fair amount of time, especially to get looking very like crisp and neat. So this is actually a big departure of that typical style for me. I'm curious to see how it will actually look for an entire army. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out on this model, and I'm actually looking forward to painting more. I think with Soul Blight around the corner, it'll actually be a nice way to bounce between the two different styles of something I've been doing for quite a long time in the way I approach the Soul Blight, and then a much more polished and refined style with my Deathwatch. I think one of my favorite parts of the model, actually, of course, doing the armor. I really enjoyed the Crozius, and despite how much work they were, the purity seals were actually quite a bit of fun to do the freehand stuff. I also really liked how the base turned out. My friends give me a lot of shit for my, let's call it simple basing in the kindest of words. And I tried to step up my game here. In my defense, I approach or I do simple bases because um, there's a purpose to it. So my Necrons and my Junk Force, I wanted to really showcase the models on top. They really, really heavily converted. There's a lot of detail going on, a lot of stuff, and I wanted simple, planar, high contrast bases to provide that sort of empty white space. It'll help accentuate the model, and it doesn't draw too much attention away from what I think should be the highlight or the feature of the model. With this one, I went a little busier because in my mind, Marines are a little simpler. It should just be primarily armor. I'm not going too ham with the conversions on this army. I will be sculpting a lot of detail, but in terms of the models themselves, they'll be fairly stock. So I wanted something a little more complex and just to try something a little more scenic and a little different, playing around with some different materials, different ways of approaching doing basing, and I just wanted to try and get a different desert ambiance feel. So I think I achieved that pretty well. Parts of the model that I actually don't like, and this will key into some of the challenges I had with the model. So the first is looking back, he's very busy. There's a lot going on that I added to the model, particularly with the purity seals. So in my mind, Black Templars are a very, very pious chapter, and they're all about oaths of the moment and of making these declarations of faith and of zeal. And to really sell that for my Black Templars chaplain, I covered him in purity seals. It looks cool, but it's actually very busy, and I didn't realize how busy it was until I got all the pieces together. That combined with his gold trim and all the detail on him as well, there's not a lot of space on the model to give visual rest to the viewer. So one of the reasons, and this is an art or design concept, is the introduction or including elements or areas of white space or negative space or blank space, however you call it. It's essentially areas where nothing's really happening. It's simpler and it's designed to complement uh, something that's more visually heavy, and it allows the eyes to rest. It creates focal points and it gives, um, I wouldn't call it a sense of ease, but it allows the viewer to go from a more high intensity state where they're looking at something that's more detailed, and then they can look very briefly at something that's a little more empty, or their eyes can just subconsciously flit to the empty space to sort of relax, calm down before jumping back. Sort of like an anxious, calm, anxious, calm. Even though those aren't the emotions you're necessarily feeling, subconsciously, if there's too much detail, so too much going on, the eyes and therefore the brain or the mind doesn't get a chance to rest, and it can become overloaded with too much information, which I feel is one of the detractors of this particular model that I did. It's all busyness. There's a lot going on, and I think in hindsight, not adding the book, maybe toning some of the purity seals down a bit, just to reintroduce at least some emptiness or some empty space at the top of the bike would have been nice. But otherwise, what's done is done. I mean, I think the model still looks great. I love it. I think it'll look great on the tabletop. And once I get more of the army done alongside it, I think it'll look fantastic. One of the other challenges I had, and this wasn't so much to do with painting, but it was to do with the sculpting. So I've used brown stuff in the past before, and I had just recently converted the navigator on my junk force, and I used brown stuff for the scrolls and parchment on that, and it was very, very durable, very, very solid. It could hold up to handling and wear and tear without an issue. And so I thought to myself, okay, I can do the same thing for the purity seals on the chaplain. The problem is I ended up going like 2 or 3 times thinner on these purity seals, and they ended up being very, very brittle. I've broken a few of them in handling, and there used to be quite a few more on this left arm that just broke off when I was priming the model, when I was handling it, and as I was painting it. And I think in hindsight, or looking to do it again, I would probably experiment with using aluminum or some sort of tin to do the purity seals instead of brown stuff. And I've actually saved a couple of cans to try for future conversions where I'm going to be using the tin instead of the brown stuff to do the purity seals, in the hope that it will be a little more durable. I also struggled with the amount of sub-assemblies I had, just in terms of handling. I don't normally wear I don't normally wear latex gloves when I'm handling my models for painting. I've never really had an issue. I use painting handles a lot, and that's never been a problem. However, with this particular model, and I think I'm going to have the exact same struggles with the outriders in the army that I'm going to be painting, is the fact that I can't avoid handling the model while I'm painting things like the undersides, the wheels, the exhaust, just separate pieces that um, I can't really blue tack the model to a painting handle because it'll keep flopping, or I need to get to different angles constantly and rotate around. So I ended up switching over to wearing gloves halfway through the model, and that reduced the chipping and the wear and tear of paint rubbing off. So that was a something I learned painting this model. I think one of the biggest challenges I struggled with mentally as well painting this model is I bounce between loving it and hating it quite a lot throughout the course of this project. And part of it was to do with not being able to visualize the model fully completed, partly because it's a huge departure in the style of painting for me. And so I wasn't quite sure how it would turn out. There was also a lot of detail, a lot of busy elements on the model that made it difficult to picture how everything would turn out once fully assembled. Um, there are times where I look at this model still and I'm not a huge fan of it. There are parts of the model that I still don't like. And I think that's partly to do as well with the original sculpt. So I'm not a huge fan of the gold trim on especially Loyalist Marines. I don't like the chest eagle on this model. I'm not a fan of the book at all. I hate this thing. If I were to do the model again, I would change the chest. The legs I'd probably keep. I would get rid of the book. Um, but it's done. The model's complete. I look back on it now, and I think the model looks great now that it's fully complete and fully painted. Um, and I'm definitely looking forward to painting more of my Deathwatch with this black armor. I think that was a really enjoyable experience. Um, I was able to actually reach points of zen, or I was able to calm down because my usual struggle with painting models is, especially for armies, I try and get it done really fast. Not to like speed through and provide subpar results, but I usually don't go 100% on my armies. I usually average like 10 to 15% effort, just because it's different goals, um, and I'm trying to achieve different things with the paint job. The goal of the army is to be fully painted to look good on the tabletop. So right, so the 3 or 4 feet rule, and so I don't go for perfect blends. I don't edge highlight every surface. The army will look good on the tabletop, and that's sort of my my mark of success. Right, one of my KPIs is, does it look good on the tabletop from arm's length? And if it does, I've achieved my goal. Very often the armies will have a couple of centerpiece characters, monsters, or heroes that I will spend that little bit of extra effort on, because that's probably where a paint judge might spend a bit more of their attention on, looking at those centerpiece models. And so I make sure that those look a little better than everything else on around them. But I usually don't put too much effort into my armies. And so um, of course, I didn't go 100% on this model either, but I did go a little further. I spent more time. I was careful with my highlights to try and keep them as crisp and neat as I possibly could, painted all the details. And it was actually a lot of fun to just, at every single step, mentally tell myself, calm down, slow it down. There's no rush. You're painting for yourself. Spend the extra effort. I think I can probably slow it down a little more. Some of my highlights looking back are quite chunky, and I might be able to neaten them up even more. It's a balance between how strong I push the highlights and how much contrast I want them to have from far away. Part of the problem with having highlights that are too thin and too crisp, they look amazing when photographed. When you're looking at the model from like 6 inches away, up close, it looks super neat. But from the tabletop, if your highlights are too thin, they don't pop, they lack the contrast. And so on the tabletop, they don't look like they are painted or polished. And that's one of the challenges between balancing out the neatness or the refinement of it for a display piece that is intended to be inspected close up from every angle, and something that's painted for the tabletop that's meant to look good and to pop from an overhead view, especially for your opponent, right? That's always one of the things to consider. I think one of the stronger elements too is the blue black. There was a point where I thought to myself, maybe it's too blue and it's not quite black enough. But I think seeing the model complete, I'm actually very happy with it. I've never been a fan of pure black armies or neutral black armies that are more in um, the flat gray department for the highlights. And you can spend the effort to push the highlights. You get them very reflective. You go to strong white, strong bands of color, or you get the strong contrast with a lot of those spot highlights. But I recognize that doing that takes a lot of time, and that's not something I want to do for an entire army of black Space Marines. And I think going for this blue black approach where there's a bit more visual interest, and you can tell that they're painted on the tabletop, right? They're not just flat black. There's a lot of visual interest to it. I think it looks really cool. I'm happy with how it turned out, even if it does lean more on the blue side. And I think what I might do for future models is just push that contrast a little more, have bigger areas of black elements, as well as some sharper highlights. I'm really happy with, for example, the foot, how it turned out here, how it turned out on this foot, and I think that's partly due to the fact that the Outrider is just a lot of flat surfaces, and then um, with this chaplain in particular, a lot of elements of detail around the model to just brighten it up and make him brighter than he's supposed to be. I feel like I would have less of an issue with the blue black if a lot of this stuff just wasn't on the model. So I think one of the takeaways when approaching models in the future, especially when I'm building and converting them, is to just have less stuff. It'll be less stuff to paint and really just focus on one or two key elements that will identify that model as belonging to their particular chapter, and then leaving the rest plain so the eyes have time to rest, and ultimately it'll still be a Black Deathwatch army. That's it for my ramblings. I was pretty much just spitballing my ideas, my thoughts, the challenges and struggles I had with this model, and things I liked.